The theme of today's session is gender-based violence, and the goal is increasing knowledge and awareness amongst midwives about how gender-based violence plays out in different contexts and what are some practical trauma-informed strategies for working with survivors. Before introducing our speakers, I want to start off this session just by giving a few brief definitions. So what is gender-based violence? Gender-based violence is violence or harm that is perpetrated against a person or a group of people because of their factual or perceived sexual, gender, or sex or gender identity. While men can experience gender-based violence, statistically, women are much more likely to be affected. There are different types of gender-based violence. There can be verbal violence, insults, name-calling, psychological violence, humiliation, manipulation, isolation, physical violence, hitting, kicking, punching, sexual violence, rape, or forced sexual acts, economic violence, controlling someone's wages, not permitting them to work, withholding money, not providing for their basic needs, and spiritual violence, not allowing someone to practice their faith, forcing someone to adopt another religion they don't identify with. You may have heard the term domestic violence. It's also called conjugal or intimate partner violence. It is one of the most common forms of gender-based violence, and it's any form of violence between people in a marital romantic relationship. It can involve any of the types of violence we mentioned: verbal, physical, economic. Some statistics on gender-based violence in Canada: half of all women in Canada have experienced at least one incident of physical or sexual violence since the age of 16. 1 in 3 Canadians has experienced abuse before the age of 15. 67% of all Canadians say they have personally known at least one woman who has experienced physical or sexual abuse. About 30% of all police reported violent crime involves a person being victimized by a current or former intimate partner. And every 6 days, a woman is killed by her current or former partner. I do want to stress that transgender people have much higher rates of domestic violence. 60% report experiences of intimate partner violence. I think we're all aware of the physical and mental consequences of gender-based violence. They range from pregnancy complications to injuries to increased risk of HIV and AIDS or other STIs to depression, anxiety, PTSD. And the consequences are not just for the person who's experienced abuse, but also for children who are exposed to violence and abuse. We are launching this presentation on what's day 2 of 16 days of awareness of gender-based violence. We launched day 1 yesterday, presenting with the Honorable Minister of Health, Patty Hadju, as well as the Minister of Women and Gender Equality, Mariam Monsef, about some of the work CAM is doing, and I'm really pleased to highlight that today. Before we start, I want to inform you, we're going to try and leave 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. And you can ask your questions through the public chat. So if you type something in, I'll read it aloud to our presenters. 2 minutes before the end of the session, a survey is going to pop up automatically in your feed, and that's your opportunity to give feedback on the presentation. Without further ado, our first presenter today is Sonia Michaelsen, who will present findings from her recent research on the impacts of COVID-19 on domestic violence and sexual assault in Canada. Sonia is currently the project officer on strengthening midwifery services in South Sudan, phase 2 for CAM. And she's also a PhD candidate in global health at the University de Montreal and works part-time at a women's shelter in Montreal. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So like Alex mentioned, today I'm just going to share some preliminary findings of a research project I've been leading on domestic violence and sexual assault during COVID-19 in Canada. So since the start of the pandemic, experts around the world have been warning about the potential ramifications of COVID-19 and social distancing measures on domestic and sexual violence. There's been media reports from China to Italy to the UK and Canada about an increased number of calls to helplines. There's even been stories emerging from the US about landlords trying to coerce cash-strapped tenants into sex-for-rent agreements. So I want to spend a little bit of time discussing why might this happen? Why might COVID-19 be associated with an increase in domestic and sexual violence? We already know from other crisis situations like natural disasters, like war, other epidemics like Ebola, that these crisis situations tend to be associated with an increase in violence. And I find it helps to look at it from a socio-ecological perspective. So what happens in the broader surrounding environment has these ripple effects that then trickle down to affect the home life. So with the case of COVID-19, and this probably seems pretty logical and intuitive, COVID-19 led to these really strict social distancing measures, which included closing down businesses and schools. So this in turn led to layoffs or working from home measures. Children were home all the time. So all of a sudden, people were together constantly, potentially in crowded locations or like tight living quarters, while also navigating this increased burden of childcare and financial insecurities, which can lead to a lot of increased stress. But then at the same time, there's less opportunity to reach out to people's like normal social supports. So whether that's family, whether that's friends, whether that's community organizations. So when these preliminary media reports were coming out, a few of us were really interested in better understanding the interplay of COVID-19 and domestic violence and sexual assault within Canada. So we formed a team of researchers, organizations, and practitioners from Université de Montréal, ANOVA Sexual Assault Services, Women Aware, and the Ending Violence Association of Canada. Really early on, we decided it would be too unethical and too risky to reach out to survivors themselves because they were currently living through this crisis situation and likely stuck at home with their abusers. So as an objective, we instead decided to better understand how COVID-19 and social distancing measures affect services for domestic violence and sexual assault and their clients. So today I'm just going to share findings specifically related to the impacts on clients. And I just want to emphasize that these findings are not necessarily representative of all survivors. And these findings, these experiences that I'm going to share, they're secondhand in nature. They're about survivors, but from the perspective of service providers who work with them. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about our methods because I think it's the findings that are most interesting. But we conducted 17 in-depth interviews with frontline and management staff of domestic violence and sexual assault services across Canada. So we had representation from Eastern, Central, and Western Canada. We also had services from larger cities versus those in smaller towns and rural areas. The types of organizations that we interviewed included crisis lines, women's shelters, advocacy organizations, counseling services, and youth centers. And what we found were these impacts that tended to have a domino effect. So probably this first finding is probably not that surprising. Survivors experienced increased isolation, as many of us did. But I think it's important to keep in mind, this is a population that already tends to be isolated, either because of controlling behaviors on the part of their abuser, or just feeling shame of what they're living through. So one person described how when you're in an abusive situation, you can at least go to work, spend time with your friends or your family, or get out, even go to Tim Hortons or whatever. But because of COVID, you're at home with an abusive person 24/7. Someone else mentioned, when you think about violence against women, breaking isolation is so key. Sometimes it's a drop-in space. It doesn't have to be a group particular about recounting your pain and speaking to a counselor. Sometimes it was just a language class or a sewing class, and now that wasn't possible. And then what we also found was that this increased isolation was compounded by technological challenge. Not having access to a phone or the internet, particularly amongst women living in poverty or in rural areas. And during COVID, so many things moved online, and this includes services like counseling services for women. So if having a phone, having access to internet becomes really critical. So a worker from a victim service organization in a remote rural area was talking about how, because our town has so much poverty, few people have a cell phone. Very few people have access to internet. There's no public phone in our town or a place where they can go to make calls or to receive calls, and few people have home phones. So because of this, because of the increased isolation, potentially not having access to a phone or to the internet, and then being at home with their partner all the time, it was really difficult for them to access services, to plan a safe exit strategy. So a director of a women's shelter was talking about how women call us when their partners are at work, and they call us when they're on their lunch break at work. They call us when they're at the hairdresser. That's a big one. So sometimes the degree of coercive control that partners have over their spouses, their partner, these women, hairdressers are one of the only things that they're allowed to do on their own. So when all of that stopped and there's no hairdresser to go to, women they just didn't have the opportunities to call us. They're stuck at home. And while survivors were experiencing this increased isolation, increased difficulty in reaching out and accessing services, we also heard reports of changes in abuse tactics and increased severity of violence. So two new abuse tactics that we heard about was actually using COVID as an abuse tool. So like, I was just overseas and I'm going to spit in your face, threatening someone with actually giving them COVID. The other one was using COVID as a justification for increased control. So abusers were saying, well, you can't go here and they won't be offering support in their clothes because of COVID. So kind of using it as an additional control tactic. Other organizations didn't necessarily mention a change in abuse tactics, but they mentioned how they noticed an increase in severity of violence. So one organization talked about how, although the frequency of calls decreased, the intensity of and the nature of the support calls that we received increased. So women were calling from their bathrooms at night, or there was a police intervention. Another woman from another organization mentioned how they actually noticed a change in the bruises. So like the bruises, they went from being fingerprints to actual handprints and broken teeth. So it's basically slaps turned into punches and bruised ribs. So women were stuck in this really difficult position and faced with really tough decisions. Do they stay at home and risk their safety in a context of violence, or do they go to shelter, which is a communal living situation typically, and risk their health? And someone from a crisis line really put it best. It's never a straightforward black and white matter of, do I stay or do I go? There's so many factors that a woman has to consider when leaving, from her financial situation to whether she has children and what that means in terms of custody and legal arrangements, to housing possibilities for her, to her safety. She might actually feel safer staying at home sometimes than choosing to break the relationship. And then you add COVID to that mix, which has complicated things even more. And it added this whole other layer of factors for women to have to work through in their decision making. So perhaps not surprisingly, service providers mentioned some pretty significant mental health consequences of COVID-19 and social distancing measures on the survivors that they worked with. They mentioned women being more emotionally distressed than before, that their situations, their cases were harder. They underlined how many survivors have pre-existing mental health issues like anxiety, depression, PTSD. And so when you already have that, when you're already navigating that and you add COVID on top of that, the fear of potentially getting COVID, having to be increasingly isolated, it just made all those conditions, all those mental health issues that much harder. Being triggered and re-traumatized was something that was brought up in the context of sexual assault survivors. So someone mentioned how, depending on the type of trauma, one of the things we've heard from a lot of survivors is the masks. Like that is intensely triggering for a lot of survivors of sexual violence. If you know, the idea is that someone's covering your mouth. Then even people, women who did decide to leave and made it safely to a shelter, it didn't automatically make it an easier situation to deal with. So shelters are usually communal living situations, and shelters were talking about how, because of that, women can make friends with each other. They might help each other out with their children. It was a way for them to break the isolation that they had been living for so long. But now, due to quarantine rules and physical distancing rules, that was gone. There was also this loss of independence. So like one place was telling me about how to restrict movements between different areas, women were no longer allowed to do their own laundry. They had a designated staff person to do it. Or like this last quote, it was hard, for staff to tell an adult who has nothing, no, you can't go sit with people and watch TV. Like, it's so small, but it was so hard because it's all they had. So essentially being told what they can and what they cannot do, which is mimicking those the very controlling situations that they just managed to escape from. So there was a lot of risk or like being re-triggered and traumatized. And something that was consistently brought up was that COVID-19 and social distancing measures have just further marginalized those who are already vulnerable. So there was a few subpopulations or groups of women that service providers brought up that they were particularly concerned about. The first one is immigrant and non-status women, newcomers, and women with language barriers. So this is a group, or these are a few groups that are potentially already isolated, and then you add additional isolation measures. So like women with language barriers, before they might have been able to go to a counseling service and bring along an interpreter. But now with the closing down of services, no face-to-face sessions, potentially not being able to hire an interpreter because things are shut down, they're no longer able to access this service in the same way. Women with children, they really struggled because of legal and custody issues if they decided to leave their partner. But also there was the fear that was mentioned about if they had to share custody with their ex and hand over their children to them, but not trust that their ex would respect or obey social distancing measures or other sanitation measures. So just having that fear that they might be exposing their kids themselves to COVID. Women living in poverty. So we talked about those technological challenges of maybe not having a phone or access to internet. Indigenous women. A woman who worked for an Indigenous organization mentioned that they usually do more communal, more group type activities for healing, for processing, whether it's sweat lodges or sharing circles. But now with social distancing, that was no longer possible. And women were actually relocated from the shelter to hotels. So they were alone in their hotel room, not able to have access to their normal coping mechanisms. So it wasn't just increased isolation, there was this sense of cultural loss. And then women with disabilities and immune system issues. So if you are someone who has pre-existing breathing problems like asthma, you're that much less likely to want to put yourself at risk by going to a shelter. So you end up being more likely to be stuck at home in this abusive situation. So basically, just to sort of summarize, some of the main points we found was increased isolation, increased difficulty in accessing services, fewer opportunities to escape, having to decide between their safety and their health, and then all the mental health impacts that come because of all these factors. And then just to wrap up, I do want to take a moment to say, okay, why is this important for midwives to know? Why is this relevant? And I think there's a few points. So midwives work with women of all backgrounds and demographics, including some of the ones that might be more at risk of experiencing domestic violence and sexual violence during COVID. Midwives may also be one of the few points of contact for survivors during COVID. If they're not able to see their friends or their family or access other community services or group activities that they're used to, midwives are still considered an essential service. And then we already know, we've known for a long time that in a normal context, violence can start or increase during pregnancy. So if you throw COVID into that, it might just speed up that process even more. And then finally, midwifery really emphasizes building those trusting relationships and that continuity of care. So women might feel more comfortable disclosing to a midwife, going to a midwife, rather than like, let's say their physician or something like that. So I just wanted to say thank you for listening, and I hope that shed a little bit of light about how COVID-19 may be affecting survivors.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Next, I'm really pleased to introduce Carol Couchie, I'm sure many of you know Carol. She's going to be speaking about gender-based violence from the perspective of Indigenous communities and from a more socio-ecological model. Carol is a National Aboriginal Council of Midwives co-chair, and Anishinaabe Ojibwe woman from the Nibissing First Nation, a midwife, a mother, and a grandmother with a keen interest in bringing birth back to the northern rural and remote areas for most of her midwifery career. Thanks, Carol. Welcome.
Thank you, Alex. So good afternoon, everybody. This is a difficult subject on so many levels, and I know you've heard me talk about some of the things that I'm going to bring up today, and that is the situation of violence in society. And I want to talk to you more about epistemic violence is maybe the word, violence that exists within our institutions. And on many, many levels, when we talk about, there used to be a saying in shelters, because I other than midwifery, the other part of my career has been working in community with gender-based violence and working on the boards of women's shelters. I was the board in Toronto at Endayan, which means our home, which is a Indigenous birth shelter there, and help build second stage housing. So second stage housing is housing that is for people that have escaped a violent situation and they're able to go and live there. And I actually raised my girls in second stage housing, and there was no men allowed in that place. Like, no men could hold the lease. Once you were in there, you weren't even technically allowed a live-in boyfriend, which was, somewhat of a problem, but that's the only way they could do what they did. It was run by the YWCA. So when we look at violence in our society, in terms of the domestic area, and we look at sayings like peace begins at home, what I would really like to say is peace begins with the community, with the country, with the leadership, and with the institutions that govern that place. So hospitals, universities, government, all of these places is really where peace begins. When we decide to be aggressive in the way we run our country and not consider every individual and not consider different communities as being fair to them, or even recognizing them as a people, there becomes a problem. And when Alex was reading off those stats, when we use those guidelines on what gender-based violence is, there's probably not one Indigenous person, both male and female, that hasn't been subject to gender-based violence. And for sure, depending on how you look, shine the light, whether you're a man or a woman, in what part of history, would really depend on what kind of violence was perpetrated to you. Because when people arrived here, women had a very different role. It was easily equal, but in some ways has more of the role that men have in our society today. They were leaders, they owned their home, they owned the land, they had economic dominion over what went on in trading and relationships. And it was up to them, to the men, to they owned certain things, but the women owned certain things, and the children belonged to them and would leave with the mother. They took on the mother's they took on the mother's, in many communities, they took on the mother's last name. What would be their dodem, what we would call, was run through the mother, because we knew who the mother was. And she or her mother was often the head of the household in terms of the physical space. And it was the men that said what went on the land in terms of trapping and hunting and all that kind of thing. And they would have different roles in their life, and depending on the gender sphere that went with, that's who was leading that team. So the violence that happened to us as a community of women, and as a community of people, as Indigenous people, is very, very huge. And it doesn't stem from the family kind of situation. It's more institutional. And that is where we have to really look at that in our society. It's not just gender-based violence in terms of everything. And I think that is obvious when we look at things that happened in a hospital this past summer, where a woman lost her life not being listened to. That is one like horrific example. And you know, and we could go on and on about that. And so as a midwife, we try not to look at a family situation as like from the stereotypical feminist perspective of, we have to save this woman. We have to save this family. How can we support both of them to go through healing and help to live a life that is nonviolent? And yes, we have to look at safety of the woman, the pregnant person, and the child, but we don't think, you know, bad perpetrator and you know, oh my goodness, here's a victim. We're all victims in this, and we need to find a way to heal together. And sometimes that healing needs to be separate, and sometimes it can happen all together. And so we have healing centers that are family centers, and we assess those situations to be able to heal a family, as opposed to going to an exclusive women's shelter. We have both, and we assess both. So I guess that's mostly what I wanted to bring up. The other thing that I wanted to talk about just briefly is that at NACAM, we have participated with CAM in the Vega project, which is violence education. Like, it's a violence education group that has now is now forming a course that will be both undergraduate and graduate. And we're working hard to bring these principles. You're going to be hearing from Anne quite a bit about one of the cardinal principles that I've been talking about, which is trauma-informed care. And again, it's trauma-informed care is about making our institutions and our midwifery practices, our institutions, whether we like it or not. We're primary care places where people go to get help. We need to make them welcoming. We need to make our universities welcoming if we're teaching. We need to make our hospitals welcoming. We want places to be welcoming. And that is the number one rule of trauma-informed care, as you will hear in our next panelist. So miigwech, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carol. When Carol talks, I always listen, and I feel like I've received a blessing and a teaching, and I'm a little emotional as I go into introducing our next presenter. Thank you, Carol. I'm pleased to introduce Anneceleste, who's going to present on trauma-informed approaches to supporting women and trans folks who have experienced violence. She's a registered drama therapist and has completed her training in couples and family therapy and works at Auberge Shalom, working with women and children who have lived with family violence. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to hear everyone speak today and to be part of this. Let me get my slideshow up real quick. Before I start, I just want everyone listening to take a moment and recognize that when we're working with clients who have trauma, we have to take care of ourselves as well, because we as first-line workers, we were impacted, and so when you were hearing Sonia talk and hearing Alix talk and hearing those statistics, make sure to take care of yourself as you hear our presentations, because you might be affected by some of the content that we're sharing. Why this is so important for midwives, I can say that right now I'm working specifically with mothers and children, and every single mother I have worked with who's been a victim of intimate partner violence, it started or it escalated during their pregnancy. So there is, and because I work only with mothers, I don't know what it's like for the women who don't, but it's so important for you as midwives who are part of that process to know it's a really high rate of increase of violence during that time. This is a quote from the National Domestic Violence Hotline in the States. "It seems like he gets angrier now that I'm pregnant. Yesterday, he started hitting me in the stomach, and all I could do was curl up on the floor and try to protect the baby. I feel so vulnerable and alone." This is one story. I hear stories all the time about postpartum depression, an increase of coercive control. Pregnancy is a vulnerable time for women. And the baby is often, if it's wanted, it's the most precious thing to a woman. And when a partner is violent, they will often attack the most precious thing to the woman. So this is why it's so important for us to offer support during this time. There's so many risks to a mother during her pregnancy: depression during the pregnancy, depression after the pregnancy, an increase or onset of violence. I've had some women who never experienced violence until the pregnancy, and then a whole shift happened, and they felt really trapped and caught. There's isolation, when they need support. I have one case where there were fertility issues and they needed to use donor eggs, and the violence was specifically about invalidating the maternal role and telling the kids it wasn't really their mom. So, it happens in other ways around the maternal role. Again, there's increased vulnerability. Some women don't want to keep the child and they're really pressured into continuing through with the pregnancy. And just how the pregnancy goes, how the parenting is, there's a lot of control around that. So these are risks to the mother during this time. There's also risks that are going to happen to the pregnancy itself. Direct injury to the fetus, miscarriage, preterm labor, low birth weight, maternal or fetal hemorrhaging, placenta disruption, stillbirth, and also the demise of both the fetus and the woman. So it's, I don't think we ever should look at just the pregnancy. I'm sure when you have the women come in, you see them holistically in their system, but both parts are really at risk during this time. I don't want to get too much into statistics, but I found it very interesting looking at when that women who are experiencing sexual or physical violence, they're more prone to depression. They report their pregnancies to be more stressful. They report that they have less support. So it's important to know that they are at increased risk, even compared to smoking, alcohol use, or drug use. The physical abuse really, really makes their pregnancy a tough time. So these are just some indications of what it might look like to have trauma in your birthing center when you're working with women. Not to say that all of these are necessarily an indication of trauma, but just, things to look out for that might resonate. Low energy, chronic fatigue, sometimes there's no real affect, flat voice, expression. Sometimes people are very anxious or jumpy, ready to run away. They could look very exhausted, visibly lacking sleep. There might be a delayed reaction to their experiences. Sometimes they can be like overly joyful, you know. There can be chronic health problems, and they can also sometimes have startled reflexes and agitation. Again, this isn't necessarily an indication of trauma, but these might be some of the signs and symptoms that you'll come across. It's also how people talk, right? Sorry, I just have to move people so I can see everything. You know, feelings of guilt, shame, intense isolation, minimizing what's happening, blaming themselves instead of their partner, and sometimes unhealthy coping mechanisms to manage the stress at this time. So we're talking about trauma-informed approaches so that people, like Carol was saying, we need to train our hospital staff, all of our systems, our schools, our legal systems, our Department of Youth Protection, because people have trauma, and particularly we're talking about trauma with violence, because a natural disaster has some type of trauma, but ongoing exposure to violence is a very different kind of trauma that we need to sensitize all of our frontline workers and people who are involved with clients to have that sensitivity, you know. And it's about our policies, it's about our organization. So this is why we're bringing this in, to increase safety and to help, like, you know, find the resilience to get these clients through these tough moments in any way that we can. It's really important for you as midwives to know your job here is not to start treating trauma. No one's expecting you to be a counselor with in-depth trauma training. It's all about a reduction of harm. You know, it's about minimizing the potential for other harm, for re-traumatization, to have more safety in the environment. These are to benefit everybody. And one of the important things I'll talk about in a minute is if we change our systems and our policies to support everybody, whether they have trauma or not, that's really how we should be functioning. It doesn't matter if the client has PTSD. There should be a standard of care that we're going to kind of cover those bases just to be safe, just to make sure, because we're not always going to know. It's not always going to be disclosed, and we want to kind of treat to that level to make sure we've covered it, whether it's there or not. So unfortunately, you know, there are things that people can do without realizing that can cause re-traumatization. So service providers can inadvertently, you know, trigger clients. And some of the ways is like touching without warning or permission, you know, speaking in a way that conveys judgment, blame, you know, especially around, like, a lot of people don't understand why women go back or why it takes them 10 times before they can successfully leave. So how we speak to clients is very important. How we interpret a client's reaction or behavior, you know, and thinking it might be unwarranted or it doesn't make sense. And I think I've seen this a lot with clients who have trauma. They will be seen as difficult, as confrontational. And so we just don't want to interpret those behaviors as negative. We want to say, what happened to this person versus why is this person doing this? And of course, being very careful not to use force, demanding language, not to tell people, but to ask people, you know, like if they have to fill in forms, to do it in a way that opens the space versus feeling directive. Another thing that we're very mindful in our institution, and as a shelter and external services, we've done our own trauma-informed care about rules. You know, if there are rules that happen around the pregnancy or the birthing center, to be aware that rules have often been imposed on these women as a way of having coercive control. So just to be mindful of how we say these are guidelines we have in place for your safety, and for it not to feel too controlling or to come down too hard. Some of the principles for trauma and violence informed approaches to cultivate an understanding of trauma and the impacts it has on people's lives and their behaviors, to create emotional and physical safety, you know, in the environment, in your interactions, Always, empowering your clients to have opportunities for choice, collaboration, and connection, and to provide strength-based and capacity-building approaches, to client coping and resilience. So you're working with them, and these moms or parents, you want them to feel that they're provided these services based on their strengths. These are some of our do's and don'ts that we give people. I'm trying to give very practical things that, and all of the slides will be sent to you after, and some other resources, like from the last slide. There's a whole list of different ways to show your understanding or to create a safe environment. Won't go through all that today, but there'll be a resource at the bottom where you can read up on some phrases you can practice and saying, But here are some do's and don'ts. Like, if a woman does open up about her violence, to just listen and support without judgment, let her know she's not alone, discuss safety concerns that you might have, help develop a safety plan. That might not be something you take on as midwives. It might be something you integrate into your birthing plan, or most importantly, just know how to direct her to appropriate resources that she'll feel comfortable using. Things to stay away from: to not blame her, to not criticize her or her partner. A lot of women who are in domestic violence, they have very ambivalent feelings. They have feelings of love, and it's not black and white. And we don't want to, by attacking or criticizing the partner, the violent partner, it actually isolates you from your alliance and your trust with the client. So it's just about staying away from that kind of criticism, not to get in the middle of it, not to put yourself in danger, to not get stuck in an idea of wanting to save somebody or to stop her from making her own decisions. So what I was talking before about improving our systems responses for everybody. If we embed these approaches in all aspects of our policy and practice, universal trauma precautions will reduce harm and increase the positive support for everybody. And I can think of, like, midwives, why this is so important to you. Let's say you have a woman coming in and you suspect that she's really not doing well because there's a lot of depression, a lot of symptoms from the violence. If your general practice is to say, I encourage all of the women to have a doctor follow up with them, if there's any history of family depression, this is the way that we encourage postpartum follow up. It becomes like a standard of practice. And then if that information is relayed to the woman and then she has to relay it to her partner, she doesn't have to say, this is just because I'm presenting in a certain way that I need to go get follow-up. It's like, oh no, the midwives say this to all of their clients, that everyone should have this kind of service and this follow-up. It will protect her from maybe being, because partners don't necessarily like their partners to have services. They don't like extra involvement. But if that's the standard of practice, it just might keep her a little bit more safe in the services she has to navigate. Not everybody is going to disclose their violence, and nor do they have to. Disclosure of violence and trauma is not our goal here. Service providers, they don't need to know the history in order to offer support. By practicing those universal trauma precautions, they can offer safe care and support whether or not there's disclosure. And there's reason why women cannot or choose not to disclose. Sometimes it's very unsafe for them to disclose. There's a history that's not central to the immediate service provided. Maybe it doesn't have to do with their pregnancy, and it's a long going history, so they won't think that they need to disclose it. Sometimes a client has a limited memory or accessibility of their trauma, so they're not going to bring it up. And sometimes it's too distressing for a client to have to get into the disclosure. And that's so important with trauma-informed care. We can offer support and care without people having to give the details, and so many people feel like, and a lot of systems say you have to prove it, you have to show us, you have to tell us again and again. And to offer services that say, we're going to treat the potential of trauma without you having to prove it, without you having to disclose it, so you feel safe and secure. It's really important. I mean, I'd love to see that happen more in the police, systems, but we'll start one trauma-informed care presentation at a time. Here are the ways in which you're going to be impacting and helping someone with trauma history. An expectant mother, let her know she's the agent in her own birthing process. You want to give her education, empowerment, and planning, any type of birth planning you do in advance. You can listen to her and validate her concerns and her needs around her pregnancy. You can assist the client. I should be just careful of gender pronouns because I know sometimes we have trans folk who are not women. The expectant client is preparing to discuss their trauma-related needs to the medical team and develop that birth plan. You want to respect physical space and change the environment if necessary. Trauma can impact our sensory perception. So lighting, sounds, loud noises, anything you can do to make someone feel comfortable is important. You can help the expecting client to become centered in the body, to listen to the baby. Sometimes like repeating empowering affirmation mantras can be really helpful in working with trauma. I've included a few in the next slide. You can suggest that she has someone with her for extra support if her partner can't or won't be there, and ask if any adjustments can be made, different positions to increase comfort, and definitely share positive birth stories. Sometimes there's so much fear around things going badly. Being able to share what has gone well in the past is important to fill in those anxious spaces. So I have a link below to like all of the positive affirmations. Some of them are, I'm doing the best I can with what I know. It's okay to be scared. Allowing the fear or the worries to have a place and to use positive affirmations is a great, simple tool with working with trauma. So those are things that you can do as like those frontline workers. And then if you're going to redirect one of your clients to other services, here's what the services might look like on the other end for you to know. So like where we are, we have 3 different services. We have a 24-hour support line. Person can call any time of day to get counseling over the phone to help direct them in terms of their needs. There's also housing services to go into shelter with their kids. Our particular services are there for Orthodox women as well. It's like the only shelter in Canada that has kosher meals and allows for the spiritual practices to continue while they're in shelter. But we service women from women and trans women. We don't service non-binary or trans male presenting folk because it's a feminist organization and we can't, the potential of it causing stress or triggers is still a blind spot we have. And direct to other services, but shelter is a way for helping a woman leave her violent home, get set up on her own. Some women don't want to leave, and that's not for us to decide. We also have external services. So where I work in the external office, it's either women who are in the relationship and not intending to leave but want to work on themselves, or some who have left. And whether you've ended the relationship doesn't necessarily mean that the violence has ended. And I work with moms who deal with a lot of violence post-separation with custody issues, parenting, ongoing abuse outside of the relationship. So you can direct them to the different services and let them know what they are, because some people are not going to be ready to even make an appointment. Some people, just a phone call is going to feel what's safe. For some people, being in shelter they're not going to feel ready for that. For somebody else, it might be. So when you direct them, to know a little bit about what you're directing them to. And once they arrive at a conjugal violence, intimate partner violence service, the agency will support them with their efforts to be the agent of their own birth. Again, the education, empowerment, support them in their planning with their midwives. We're going to listen and validate the client's concerns and needs. We're going to conduct safety planning and explore child custody matters. And that's where I was saying before, the safety planning, you can do a little bit around the birth, but that's something for the social workers to hold space for. You don't have to take that on. We're going to assist survivors in accessing prenatal and postnatal care, help them attain maternity and baby care supplies if they need. We're also going to promote and share positive birth stories and ask the client their individual choices and how they want to parent and raise their children. Always want to bring it back to them being the leader, them being the expert. We're not here to be on a higher level and them lower down. We want to equalize and say, we are the expert of our services, but you're the expert of your lives, and how can we co-collaborate in this process together? So that's a little bit in terms of the trauma-informed care to the clients. Part of trauma-informed care is also about how you take care of yourself. Ongoing exposure to trauma causes vicarious trauma. You hear these stories, you hear these details, that's going to resonate somewhere with you. That's going to cause your own reactions. It can also cause compassion fatigue, after long periods of time, and burnout. So it's important to always assess, how am I doing with this? I had a really intense, coaching birth story yesterday, and I know this client is not safe, and I directed them, I need some personal self-care time to manage how that impacted me holding that space. So anything you can do in terms of counseling, meditation, exercise, healthy eating. Also look at your work culture. How can the system support the midwives or the frontline workers with manageable caseloads, the mental health resources, paid time off, benefits, trainings like the one you're doing right now, developing awareness around chronic emotional stress and taking care of yourself while you're taking care of others. And supervision, being able to share what you're going through with somebody else on your team, to have a second, opinion come in so you can process the interactions that you might have had with the patient. Besides directing, clients to us, you can also direct clients to support from doulas. Actually, I had doulas reach out to also want a trauma-informed care training. Family doctors, mental health professionals. The truth is, sometimes, unfortunately, family doctors and mental health care professionals are not the best with trauma-informed care, but it's just important to know who else can be following women during their pregnancy. I have a client who the previous partner of her ex ended up in a psychotic episode during the pregnancy because the violence increased so much and it became unmanageable for her. So when my client became pregnant and started realizing she was having anxiety and she was worried about postpartum, she got services from a social worker and a family doctor, and that follow through really kept her safe. So knowing ongoing support people are important for our clients. There are some online resources from where all this information comes from, and some interesting books that might be from survivors giving birth, and then our numbers and contact information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. I want to thank each of our presenters today. I feel like you each brought an important piece of this puzzle. Sonia contextualizing gender-based violence within, the context of a global pandemic. Carol really speaking to intersectionality of gender-based violence and really highlighting for us that when we talk about patriarchy or gender-based violence, we're often talking about white patriarchy and colonialism, and recognizing that gender dynamics are different in different cultures. And then Anne for really, bringing home for us that as midwives, you can feel like it's such a burden, but our job is not to treat the trauma, it's to minimize the harm. So really appreciating everyone's presentations today. And we also want to really focus at CAM on the intersection between gender-based violence and family violence. And I mentioned that we were presenting yesterday for the launch of the 16 days. And we were presenting about a partnership between CAM, NACAM, and McMaster University. And it's a project to build midwives' capacity to recognize and respond safely to child maltreatment, children's exposure to intimate partner violence, as well as intimate partner violence. And it's a 3-year project, and it's funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. We will be conducting surveys to identify gaps in knowledge and skills, and then designing and delivering an undergraduate course for midwifery students, as well as other professional development materials and training sessions. And we're really hoping that with this project, we can help midwives support early intervention and mitigate the devastating impacts of family violence. We have just a few minutes left to ask questions here. In 2 minutes, questions will pop up. I'm seeing lots of gratitude. Thank you, everyone. So hard to hear, but so integral. Self-care so we can support others. I can see someone said, thank you, Carol. It was hard to hear, but a good reminder that, and it's even hard to type, there can be 2 victims. Thank you. Such hard things to hear. Thank you. It's insightful and terribly sad. So while we're watching to see, I think the survey is up now. I do want to conclude by thanking everyone for joining this session today. You can follow on social media channels. CAM is going to be sharing resources and information on gender-based violence in Canada, but also globally over the 16 days of action. And please stay tuned for more information about our gender-based violence project and how you can get engaged. I do now want to invite everybody to click on the list of sessions to join the High Rock Fitness Break starting now. Following this, you can join the presentation on building evidence for best practices in midwifery skills transfer and reciprocal midwifery association strengthening, which starts at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I do also want to remind you that all sessions are recorded and will be made available in a few days. And you'll be able to find them on the list by scrolling down to the bottom of the list, or you can search by category for session recordings. And those session recordings will be up until December 31st. So there's no rush to get through content that you may have missed or that you want to dive deeper into. You can also visit our exhibitors by clicking on the exhibit hall. Great. Sonia, Carol, Anne, are there any kind of final thoughts you'd like to share with everyone or reflections from the presentations? We've got about 2 minutes left.
Thank you, Alex, for explaining our project together much better than I did. But that's exactly what I was talking about. The undergraduate program is course is going to be brilliant, and I really look forward to helping some of our newest midwives navigate this in a much better way than we were able to, just because we were new 20 years ago, you know.
Yeah, and maybe just to mention, so because this is the international campaign, like the 16 days to end gender-based violence, CAM is also doing a social media campaign for the next 16 days. So if you follow us on social media, it's also an opportunity to maybe just learn about additional resources and facts and services out there.
Thanks, Sonia. And I see that someone's provided a little link to our press release in the chat as well, if people are interested.
And just to, again, sorry to steal time, but what Anne says is that to reduce harm is really our goal. But also when we offer all of these kindnesses in the face of such a horrible subject and a hard thing to hear, what comes out of all of it is hope. And that's the greatest gift we could give to anybody.
And resilience. There's so, as much as trauma changes the brain, resilience comes out of it as well.
Thank you for ending on that message of hope and resilience. That was just what we needed today. And that brings us to noon. So I'm going to thank everybody for joining us and thank all our speakers again. And we'll see you at the fitness break.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.